Well, if you've noticed the title of this episode, I hope that you are a little bit surprised or even concerned that I would be talking about behavior modification for Montessorians. I want to cover three main points on this because I do believe it's something that every Montessori educator needs to understand carefully. First and foremost, behavior modification is simply influencing another person's behavior. Anytime you interact with someone else, a child or another adult, what you're doing is going to influence what they're doing. And that is the most important thing to keep in mind about behavior modification. So let's back up a little bit and make sure that I'm clear on what I mean and what I don't mean in terms of ways that I want you to use behavior modification to assist the children and the adults that are in your school environment. First, behavior modification is based on operant conditioning. If you have taken any psychology classes, you probably have some vague memory of B.F. Skinner and dogs and bells and things like that. And that is exactly what I'm talking about. The downside, or the part of behavior modification that I do not encourage you to use in any way, shape, or form, is overt rewards and punishments. This is what behavior modification is most associated with. So, if a dog does a behavior and gets a reward, then that is shaping the behavior by positive reinforcement. This is also done with adults, with children in different formats, within different schools of discipline, different approaches to discipline. I am not recommending that in any way, shape, or form. So please don't think that overt rewards or punishments are what I'm talking about. However, what's very important to understand is that first piece that I said. Every time you interact with someone, you influence their behavior. So there is a good chance that you are either subtly rewarding or punishing them in some way or another. Now, the more mature the person, the more they are self-motivated, the more that they act from their own initiative, from their own set of values and their own desires to create in the world, the less your influence is probably going to sway them one way or the other. Not surprisingly, children are very easy to sway. So why would I say that you need to be aware of behavior modification? Well, the second thing that I want you to keep in mind, besides the fact that you're always influencing the people around you, is that you need to modify your own behavior. And that's the way I would like you to think about this the most, is you need to be, number one, aware of how you are influencing or modifying the behavior of others, and you need to be consciously modifying your own behaviors so that you are giving clear and appropriate messages. Now, before I go to that third point, let's look at that for a few minutes. Let's think about some of the interactions that Montessori classroom leads or Montessori classroom assistants have with children and how that might fit into this model that I am suggesting to you. So one that's pretty easy to recognize is if you have a child coming up to you and asking for your attention. If the child is asking for your attention and you give that attention, that's a successful behavior on the part of the child. You have subtly rewarded that child. So let's say that the child comes up to you and asks for your attention while you're speaking with another child by saying your name over and over again and tugging at your clothing. What is your best approach? Well, what I'm going to suggest is that you recognize you have one chance and only one chance to perfectly ignore a behavior. And that is the least intrusive way to keep from rewarding the behaviors that are disrespectful in your classroom. So if that child is mostly intruding on you, they're intruding on the child you're speaking with a little bit, but they're mostly intruding on you, your very best approach may be to simply ignore them. Now, I would not say that that is appropriate or respectful to that child unless several things have come before. If you have presented the idea that when you are interacting with another child, that there's a specific way to come up and ask for attention, if you have presented that several different times, perhaps you have shown this particular child that, and when they have come up and used the old behaviors that they've learned from other adults to get attention, if you have stopped what you were doing previously and given them a representation, which would sound something like, I'm speaking with Anne, I will speak with you after I'm finished. You may touch me on the elbow and wait. That would be an appropriate representation the first time that a child does that. You could also ignore it. If you have given that presentation in a group or you've given the presentation to that child, it would be appropriate to continue interacting with Anne and let that child get the message. This isn't something that I can give you a firm guideline on. It depends on the child behind you. It depends on the child in front of you. But what I want you to make absolutely sure you understand is that your response is either reinforcing the behavior that the child has just done or causing that child to recognize it's not going to get them what they want. And that is a very, very important understanding for everyone in a Montessori classroom to have who seeks to appropriately and respectfully modify disrespectful behaviors. So, one of the most important principles about that's a subpoint under you influencing the children every time you interact with them is recognize the power and the appropriateness of ignoring a disrespectful behavior, particularly if the goal of that behavior is to get your attention. So let's give another example. You have a group of children together, maybe a small group for a lesson, maybe the entire class when you're making announcements or have a full class meeting or celebration going on. So you have in your class the procedure that if you want to get attention in the whole group, you raise your hand and you wait to hear your name. It's a good procedure. So what happens when someone speaks out without raising their hand or raises their hand but doesn't wait for you to say their name? Again, one of your most powerful and respectful behaviors is simply to call on one of the children who is following the procedure. Again, if you're doing this with a mean look to the ones that are speaking out or without having clearly presented this procedure, that's disrespectful to the children. They want your attention, they want the attention of the group, and they are simply doing their best to learn how to get that. So you need to keep that in mind while you respectfully give them the most appropriate response. Now, the last piece that I want you to think about when you're thinking about behavior modification is that idea of reinforcement. Anytime that you are working in that classroom, you need to be aware of whether or not what you're doing is reinforcing or discouraging the behaviors that are happening around you. One of the ways that you encourage children to talk too loud or you encourage children to call across the room when they need to get someone's attention is if you do that yourself. That is behavior modification. It's a lesson. Anytime you do something, whether you know it or not, you're presenting a lesson. Now, in this case, I'm going to suggest that that's not the main thing I'm talking about here. Mostly when I'm talking about the behavior modification principles that you need to understand and take into consideration as you respond to each of the children is exactly that. How your response is going to affect the behavior that came immediately before. So if a child calls to you from across the classroom, what is your best response? Your worst response is to call across back to them. You have given them the attention that they were asking for, and you have modeled back to them the behavior that they used to get that attention. So is that behavior going to happen again and again? Most likely. And It should. That's what you've done. You've just said, yes, that's an appropriate way to act, and I'm going to do the behavior back to you. Obviously, you're telling the child that's an okay behavior. So what's a better approach? Well, depending on what's going on in the rest of the classroom, at the very least, before you responded to the child, you would model the appropriate behavior. So you would walk all the way across the classroom before you interacted with that child. Now, I'm going to suggest that there's 3 different behaviors that you watch for, and you be very, very careful about how you respond to them or don't respond to them. One is an idea of the procedure of not interrupting anyone else's work. So the first example that I gave you, when you're speaking with Anne and another child comes up and talks with you, that child was interrupting your conversation with Anne. So you would not want to just reflexively interact with that child. That child is interrupting, so you need to think very, very carefully about how you're going to respond. You're giving a lesson with another child, and a child comes up and interrupts. Or maybe just a child is sitting working with their own work, and another child comes up and interrupts. Now maybe that child comes up and interrupts with help. You might think, well, that's fine. That's giving that child help. But what is our procedure? Our procedure is we don't interrupt people in the midst of their own work, because the foundation of Montessori education is us learning on our own, us working through our own problems, us learning from our own self-chosen work. And so interrupting that behavior, or at the very least not reinforcing it, is very important. So be very, very careful before you respond or react to a child who is interrupting. Second is the idea that in order to keep a peaceful classroom going on, we should have eye contact and be right next to each other before we interact. Imagine if in your classroom no one interacted unless the whole group was present. You were doing a silent game, you were doing a celebration of life. Unless the whole group were present, the only interactions that took place were when people were making eye contact and they were right next to each other. Would that be a pretty peaceful classroom? Yes. So second behavior to be very much aware of is if a child is interacting with another child or with you and they're not making eye contact and they're not right next to each other, be very careful how you respond or react to that behavior. And the last one that I'm going to suggest is any kind of behavior that is being intrusive in any way. So maybe a child is being loud. Maybe they're making a sound maybe they're making an unconscious sound, a pencil tapping or something like that. Be very careful about how you respond to that. Think about whether it's simply an unconscious behavior, something the child isn't aware of. That would probably be something that would be worthwhile to very respectfully within your procedures to interrupt. But if it's something that the child might be doing to get your attention, maybe they're wandering around, maybe they're tapping a pencil, maybe they're using the work in a certain way, be very much aware of whether or not there's a chance that the child is actually doing that to get your attention. Now, please do not misunderstand me. If a child is seeking your attention, you need to give that child attention. That needs to be something you put on your observations. It needs to be at the top of your awareness. This child is asking for my attention. I need to figure out a way to give it. But just because that child has asked for your attention does not mean you need to give the attention immediately after the disruptive behavior that is the request for attention. So, do classroom Montessorians need behavior modification understanding? Absolutely. The most important thing for you to do is be aware before you respond. Is the response you're giving something that's going to reward a behavior and reinforce it, or is it going to distinguish or serve to tend to extinguish the behavior or discourage it? If you keep those things in your awareness as you're interacting with the children, as you're making your observation, as you're conferring with the other adults in the classroom, I think you'll find that your effectiveness in a very respectful, subtle way is going to be much improved.
Well, these are called step boards. Sometimes it's really the company's name is Insta-Learn by Step. But again, the nice feature about this is that it's self-correcting, and the vocabulary starts off with short vowels, goes all the way through to high-frequency sight words. But the students, again, can only spell the word correctly. So only the B, the E, and the D will fit here. And kids that already know how to spell bed will try to trick the board, and they'll come and they'll see if they can't fit another letter, just to test the board. But whenever I ask people who use this what they think of it, the first thing they say is, my kids love it. And then they go on to talk about other aspects of it. But this seems to have an appeal for some children more than others, and oftentimes teachers have shared with me that some students that wouldn't do anything when the step words are presented to them just absolutely saturate themselves with the experience of working on the step. So the step words goes all the way from visual perception to word spelling, all the way up to math, multiplication, and division. And Jane Pittman has been a user. She's a Montessori teacher and director. Maybe she can share a few things.
Yes, I've had two schools, and they were equipped with these step boards. The children love them. They absolutely love them for what David was saying, that they're self-correcting and that they could manipulate them and work with them as a puzzle until they could figure it out. I love the fact that they had these individually marked teeth. And what was also nice was the huge assortment of these strips that they could put at the bottom. And that they are plastic, but it's wonderful. You can wipe them, you can keep them clean, they're durable, they last, they don't wear out, they can be sanitized, they're really, really wonderful.
In previous phonics episodes, we've talked about the fact that phonics knowledge has kind of fallen out of our culture in a lot of ways. I would guess, but I certainly can't swear to this, but I would guess that of children and particularly adults of the time when my mother was a child, which was in the early 1920s, actually late 1920s, I would guess that if you were to ask an adult several sounds that A makes, they could probably tell you. I have found from experience that when I ask an adult what several sounds of A are or several sounds of O are, they usually can come up with two, a short sound and a long sound, particularly if they're a teacher. But beyond that, they look at me a little bit lost. Now, if I give them some clues like the word ball, then they can usually generate a few more. And if I say, what about the schwa sound? Usually I just get sort of glazed over looks. So what I'm going to suggest in this episode is that if you want to help your child to read, and if you are taking a phonetic approach, which is essential in Montessori education from my experience and from any reading education for most children, not all, some will just pick up the code from you reading aloud to them, but for teaching reading to most children, phonics is essential. And if you as an adult are taking that approach and you are your students or your child's reading coach, you need to have that material solid within yourself. Now, what do I mean by a reading coach? That seems a little bit strange. Why do I use the word coach? Well, let's give as an example the idea that your child is in a Montessori school and you are the parent who is attempting to extend and support the phonetic reading that your child is doing at school. You're the reading coach at night. You're the one that when they pull out the Dr. Seuss book or perhaps some Bob books or other phonetic readers that you've made sure were available for your beginning reader to use at home, you're the one that they rely on to help them when they get to the edge of their learning. They're the one that they rely on to help understand, well, why does that word not say gh at the end? And I'm referring to though, which of course has a silent GH at the end. Why don't you say gh? And you need to be able to say those are silent letters, and so we don't say them. And you also need to be able to say, and the OU in that word says O, because it does. And there's quite a few other words in which OU says O. If you're not able to do that, you're not going to be able to support your child in reading as well as you might. Now, if all they're reading is words like dog, you may be on the lookout for reversals. So if they say bog, it's probably going to be pretty clear to you that they're reversing their B's and their D's, but otherwise it's pretty easy. But what about when you get to a word like gem? Even though that's a 3-letter word, short vowel sound, you need to be ready to say it's not a gem because that word uses the second sound of G, j. And if they're a little bit older, you may even say, see the signal? It's followed by an E. That tells you that the G says j. Now, the reason that I am saying these examples that are pretty easy to imagine is because in my experience, not only most parents, but most Montessori teachers don't have this kind of information right at the tip of their tongue when they're working with a child who's reading. And so one of the things I've attempted to do is make it easier to master, and even make it easier to have some cheat sheets if you need them. This is a vowel chart that I use when I'm helping people to understand this. It does give the different sounds of the letters. It gives them in isolation, it gives them in combination. So when you're looking at any word that only has one vowel in it, and that word is A, you know it's either going to say a, or a. And that is the order in which it is most common. One of the things that I have found is that when I break these kinds of pieces of phonics content down in this way, it is easy for a motivated adult, whether it be a classroom educator or a parent, to master these pieces of information that they need to most effectively support their beginning reader when they're sitting and reading with them.